The Roman Republic stood at the height of its power, its marble temples gleaming beneath the Mediterranean sun, its roads stretching like veins across conquered lands, carrying soldiers, goods, and the illusion of eternal order. To Roman citizens, this was an age of triumph, where banners of victory fluttered above forums and generals were celebrated as near-divine figures. Yet this greatness rested on a vast, silent population that Rome refused to see as human. Millions of slaves formed the hidden foundation of the Republic. Men, women, and children taken from defeated nations, torn from families, stripped of names, and reduced to property. They tilled the fields that fed the cities, mined the stone that built the monuments, rowed the ships that ruled the seas, and cleaned the homes of those who called themselves free. Slavery was not a flaw in Rome's system. It was the system. Without it, Rome's economy, military dominance, and social hierarchy would collapse. Among the enslaved, none were more visible yet more dehumanized than the gladiators. Men trained not to live, but to die for entertainment. Locked inside brutal schools like the one in Capua, they were beaten into obedience, starved into submission, and drilled relentlessly until violence became instinct. The crowd saw heroes. The masters saw investments. But behind the arena walls were broken bodies stitched together again and again, forced to fight friends, brothers, and strangers for applause that meant nothing. Rome believed terror was the ultimate control. Chains that cut into flesh, whips that split skin, iron collars stamped with ownership, and crucifixions lining roads as warnings to any who dared dream of escape. Rebellion, Rome insisted, was impossible. Slaves were too divided, too frightened, too dependent to unite. Past uprisings had been drowned in blood, reinforcing the belief that resistance was futile. Yet beneath the noise of markets and the roar of amphitheaters, something dangerous was growing. Every insult endured in silence, every scar hidden beneath armor, every comrade left to die in the sand added weight to a shared hatred. In stolen moments, while sharpening blades, tending wounds, or lying awake in darkness, slaves whispered of lost homelands, of lives before chains, of a freedom they barely remembered but refused to forget. What Rome mistook for acceptance was endurance. What mistook for weakness was restraint. The Republic's greatest mistake was believing that fear erased memory, that suffering crushed identity. Instead, it forged something harder. Inside the gladiator school at Capua, resentment did not fade. It organized. Men who had once fought in distant wars recognized discipline in one another, learned patterns in their captors' routines, and understood that the violence Rome taught them could be turned back against its masters. Among these men stood one figure whose presence commanded attention, not through titles or privilege, but through quiet strength and unbroken spirit. He listened more than he spoke, endured punishment without submission, and carried himself not like a beast awaiting slaughter, but like a soldier awaiting command. Rome did not notice him, because Rome never looked closely at its slaves. Yet within those walls, something had shifted. The chains were still there, the guards still watched, and the whips still cracked, but the fear had begun to change sides. The empire believed it had buried resistance beneath stone and law, but in truth, it had concentrated it, sharpened it, and taught it how to fight. And in that darkness, before the world would know his name, the idea of defiance took its first breath. Spartacus was not born into chains, and that truth shaped everything he became. Long before the arena's sand stained his skin with blood, he had known freedom, discipline, and the structure of war. Likely a Thracian by birth, he had once served as a soldier, trained to fight not for spectacle, but for survival, before fate turned him from warrior into property. Captured, sold, and condemned to the gladiator school at Capua, Rome attempted to erase his past and replace it with obedience. But slavery could control his body, not his mind. Inside the school, Spartacus watched, listened, and learned. He studied the guards' routines, the weaknesses in discipline, and the fear hidden behind cruelty. Rome believed gladiators were dangerous only in the arena, useful tools whose violence could be switched on and off at will. What it failed to understand was that by training slaves to fight, it had created men who understood strategy, pain, and death better than most Roman soldiers. In 73 BCE, desperation turned into decision. Spartacus and roughly 70 fellow gladiators realized that survival itself was rebellion. Armed with nothing more than stolen kitchen knives, spits, and sharpened tools, they struck with speed and precision, overwhelming their guards and breaking free from captivity. It was not a polished escape. It was raw, violent, and fueled by certainty that death was preferable to chains. They fled toward Mount Vesuvius, hunted men running with nothing but resolve, yet something extraordinary happened along the way. Slaves from nearby farms, workshops, and villas heard the whispers and saw the signs. For the first time, escape did not end in capture. It succeeded, and hope spread faster than fear. Men and women abandoned their masters, risking everything to follow a rumor of freedom. What began as a small band of fugitives swelled into hundreds, then thousands, forming a force Rome had never imagined possible. Spartacus emerged not by declaration, but by action. He did not rule through terror or privilege. He earned loyalty by sharing hardship, fighting alongside his followers, and refusing the comforts others offered him. He understood that an army of slaves could not survive as a mob. Drawing on his military experience, he organized them into units, imposed discipline, and demanded restraint when vengeance threatened to turn into chaos. Weapons were taken from defeated Roman forces, armor redistributed, and training enforced. These were no longer runaway slaves, they were soldiers. Roman commanders dismissed early reports, assuming any resistance could be crushed with minimal effort, but those assumptions shattered with the first defeats. Patrols sent to capture the rebels were ambushed and destroyed. Supplies meant for Rome were seized. Each victory brought not just weapons, but confidence. Spartacus demonstrated a keen understanding of terrain, using hills, forests, and surprise to neutralize Rome's numerical advantage. He avoided direct confrontation when unnecessary, striking where Rome was weakest and retreating before reinforcements could arrive. The psychological impact was devastating. Roman soldiers, trained to see slaves as inferior, now faced enemies who fought with coordination, intelligence, and ferocity. As word spread across Italy, the rebellion transformed into something far more dangerous than escape. It became an alternative order. Within the ranks of the slave army, social divisions that Rome relied upon began to dissolve. Nationalities, languages, and former statuses mattered less than shared purpose. Freedom was no longer an abstract dream. It was practiced daily in collective decision-making and mutual defense. Spartacus encouraged this unity, knowing that Rome's strength lay in division. With each passing month, the Senate's confidence eroded. Senators who had mocked the uprising now fortified their estates and feared their own servants. The idea that slaves could organize, strategize, and defeat Roman forces was unthinkable, and yet undeniable. Spartacus had become the symbol of that impossible truth. He did not claim kingship, nor did he promise conquest. What he offered was something far more dangerous to Rome: proof. Proof that the enslaved were not weak, that fear could be overcome, and that Rome's authority was not divine, but enforced, and therefore breakable. By the time Rome understood the scale of the threat, it was already too late. The rebellion was no longer about escape alone. It was about dignity reclaimed through force, and a leader who showed that even in chains, a soldier could rise, an army could form, and an empire could be made to tremble. As Spartacus' army continued to grow, Rome's confidence began to rot from the inside. What had once been dismissed as a minor disturbance now threatened the very structure of the Republic. Tens of thousands of former slaves moved across the Italian countryside, leaving fear in their wake and hope behind them. Estates were abandoned, fields went unharvested, and trade routes fell into disorder as masters fled or barricaded themselves inside their villas. For Rome's ruling class, the terror was not only military but psychological. Slavery was the backbone of Roman society, and the sight of slaves in open rebellion shattered the illusion of absolute control. The Senate argued, delayed, and underestimated the danger, convinced that tradition and reputation alone would restore order. Initial Roman forces sent to crush the rebellion were poorly led and motivated, their commanders more concerned with preserving status than understanding their enemy. These armies collapsed under the pressure of an opponent that fought with desperation and intelligence, using speed, surprise, and the land itself as weapons. Each Roman defeat echoed through Italy like a warning bell, proving that the Republic's legions were not invincible. Spartacus understood that fear could be wielded just as effectively as swords. He allowed Rome to see its weakness, striking where it hurt most, humiliating officials who had never imagined themselves outmatched by those they once owned. Yet within the rebel ranks, a deeper struggle emerged. Victory brought choices, and choices brought division. Many believed the time had come to march north, cross the Alps, and escape Rome forever, returning to homelands long lost. Freedom beyond Italy seemed within reach. Others, hardened by years of cruelty, demanded vengeance. They wanted to turn south, challenge Rome directly, and destroy the system that had enslaved them. Spartacus stood between these visions, aware that hesitation could be fatal. He knew that prolonged indecision favored Rome, whose resources were vast and patience limited only by pride. Despite his leadership, unity was fragile, tested by the weight of suffering and the lure of retribution. Meanwhile, panic spread through the capital. Senators feared not just defeat, but precedent. If Spartacus succeeded, even partially, the idea of resistance would infect every slave in the Republic. Rome responded as it always had when threatened from within, with cruelty and concentration of power. The Senate granted extraordinary command to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, known for his ambition and brutality. Crassus understood that this war was not about honor. It was about restoring fear. He rebuilt shattered legions with iron discipline, enforcing obedience through decimation, executing 1 in 10 soldiers who showed cowardice. The message was clear. Rome would be more merciless to its own men than allow another defeat by slaves. Crassus moved methodically, cutting off supply lines, fortifying positions, and forcing Spartacus into increasingly narrow options. The rebels fought fiercely, but the balance of power began to shift. Rome's legions adapted, learning from earlier mistakes and refusing to underestimate their enemy again. Still, Spartacus proved elusive, breaking through traps and striking unexpectedly, reminding Rome that this war would not end easily. The Italian countryside became a battlefield of attrition, marked by burned villages, mass desertions, and constant skirmishes. For ordinary Romans, the war shattered the sense of safety that empire was supposed to guarantee. For the enslaved, it remained a beacon, proof that resistance was possible, even if victory was uncertain. As both sides prepared for an inevitable final confrontation, the rebellion reached its most dangerous point. Rome stood humiliated but determined, its pride wounded and its authority challenged. Spartacus' army stood hardened by victory and loss, aware that retreat was no longer guaranteed. The struggle had evolved beyond escape or survival. It had become a test of whether Rome's power rested on destiny or fear. And in that moment of uncertainty, the Republic trembled, not because it was about to fall, but because it had been forced to look into a mirror and see its own vulnerability staring back. The final chapter of the rebellion unfolded with a weight of inevitability pressing down on both sides. Crassus had tightened the noose, driving Spartacus and his followers toward a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Supplies dwindled, allies thinned, and the vastness of Rome's resources began to reveal itself. Yet even as defeat loomed, the slave army did not fracture into despair. These were men and women who had already lost everything once. Surrender meant a return to chains, torture, and execution. There would be no negotiations, no mercy, and no compromise. Spartacus understood this truth with brutal clarity. He did not speak of victory anymore, only of dignity. According to Roman accounts, before the final battle, he killed his own horse, declaring that if he won, he would have plenty of Roman horses, and if he lost, he would have no need of one. It was not a gesture of theatrics, but of resolve. He would stand and fight as a free man or die as one. When the armies met, the battlefield became a place of raw human will rather than strategy alone. Spartacus charged into the Roman lines, ignoring wounds, cutting a path toward Crassus himself, determined not to escape history, but to confront it head-on. The rebels fought with a ferocity born of memory. Every lash, every humiliation, every life stolen from them fueling each strike. Rome's legions, disciplined and relentless, closed in from all sides, their numbers and coordination slowly overwhelming the exhausted army of former slaves. One by one, the rebels fell, surrounded by steel and inevitability. Spartacus was wounded, then wounded again, yet continued to fight, refusing capture, refusing submission. When he finally fell, his body vanished into the chaos, unrecognized, unclaimed, as if even Rome could not fully contain what he represented. The war ended, but Rome's response was far from finished. In an act meant to erase the memory of rebellion, Crassus ordered the crucifixion of approximately 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, the main road leading into Rome. For miles, crosses lined the horizon, bodies left to rot as a living warning to every slave who passed beneath them. Fear was restored through spectacle, but the cost was permanent. Rome had won the battle, yet it could not undo what had been revealed. For years, a slave army had humiliated the Republic, defeated its generals, and forced its elites to confront the truth that their power depended on oppression maintained by violence. Laws tightened, punishments grew harsher, and suspicion poisoned relationships between masters and servants. Rome became more secure, but also more afraid. Spartacus did not conquer Rome, and his rebellion ended in blood, but its impact echoed far beyond the crosses. His name became synonymous with defiance, whispered in slave quarters, and remembered by those who understood that resistance, even when crushed, could change the world. The Republic would go on to become an empire, larger and more powerful than before, yet forever marked by the knowledge that its greatest threat had once risen not from foreign kings or rival generals, but from the people it had tried to erase. The slave army failed to break Rome, but it succeeded in shaking the Roman world to its core, leaving behind a lesson written not in stone or law, but in memory, that no system built on chains is ever truly unchallenged, and no empire, however mighty, is immune to the courage of those who refuse to accept their place in silence.